First of all, thank you for, look, this isn't what I would have picked, no judgment, but, you do you, but it's very nice to see everyone here. When I give talks I gave a talk at my own university to my own student, the Catholics, and there was 2 people, and they were the organizers, right? So it's it's like a prophet is not without honor, except. Anyway, so what I want to do in this talk is to try and ground some of these big issues we've been talking about. We've had the philosophy, the theology, we've had top scientists, and we've talked about aesthetics. I want to kind of look and kind of, in this kind of loose, rambling talk through of what all this looks like on the ground. Both if we have this particular narrative, where did it come from? Why does it seem so obvious to so many people? But also, if it's not the case that science and religion are kind of, inimical, foes, and it's possible to be very religious and very scientific, or vice versa. How does that actually play out in the way people perceive science and religion? And also, the flip side of this is if there is this idea that religious people must be irrational or stupid or they've not really thought about stuff, and you can't really be a proper scientist and be really religious, then there's a flip side to that, and that's this kind of assumption that, well, atheists, they must be really scientific and really rational, okay? And they must be cleverer than normal people. They'll tell you this themselves, right? They tend to be, higher IQ, more educated, more rational, and you often hear people say, well, the reason I gave it all up was because I'm just too rational. I just think about things too deeply. So obviously I couldn't be a whatever like you. Okay. So this, in fact, I created this PowerPoint. I didn't realize that Larry Principe was both at the conference, because I didn't read the materials. But also that he's doing one of the other breakout sessions now. So this is here's what you could have won, right? So, this is just a really nice summation of the issue, but also the problem. Although rejected by every serious historian of science today, the conflict or warfare model for the historical interaction of science and religion remains not only widespread, but naturalized as a fact in popular culture. So, in a sense, the first 2/3 of that sentence we've covered well in this conference, okay? It's the last bit that I kind of want to spend a bit of time thinking through here. And I want to introduce both some kind of bigger background issues as to why I think that, this idea caught on when it did, and it has a particular history and a particular kind of life story, this idea. But also I want to introduce a couple of studies, recent work, that kind of digs into how this plays out on the ground. Among real people, and particularly among real atheists and agnostics and real kind of unaffiliated nons. Particularly focused on America, but we're going to look at some bigger stuff too. America's pretty big, it's big enough, right? Don't get me wrong. So, this idea that there's a kind of, first of all, just think about how weird it is. Science is, it's a pretty, throughout all human history and, throughout all contemporary society today, science as a single noun picks out an awful lot of different things and people and places and institutions and ideas and ways of viewing the world. And religion, likewise, it covers a vast, even today, religion can mean all sorts of things. It has all sorts of expressions, all sorts of religions, but all sorts of, even within a single religion, there's all sorts of different theologies, different cultures. Okay, so it's already going to be a problematic claim to make that science, religion, that there's some kind of single relationship between the two that kind of makes sense as an overarching kind of true for the ages claim. Now, of course, it's true that it's easily possible to to tell a particular story. And it's important to realize that this science-religion conflict arises at a particular place, arises mainly in America, a particular place in time, a particular place in history, the late 19th century. This is an idea that this kind of conflict model, this warfare metaphor, only arises then. And, I mean, there's a big kind of historical story as to why that works, why that happens, what's feeding into that at that moment, and why it catches on. But it's a story that relies upon certain kind of iconic moments and certain ways of telling the story and certain ways of presenting particular episodes. So you get Galileo. Okay? You get Columbus in the early account. Now, the whole Columbus thing is just actually made up. Like this kind of Columbus thought the world was round and everyone at the time thought it was flat, and he went to Salamanca, and all the priests there told him that it was heresy and he'd fall off the edge of the world and there's dragons, right? But he did it anyway, and it was this kind of great age of exploration and thinking for oneself. And it's complete nonsense. So first of all, like everyone thought the world was round and always had, right? Like not at least anyone historians, philosophers, theologians. You go back and read the ancient Greeks, go back to the ancient Romans, read Ovid. Like literally the first couple of sentences of Ovid's Metamorphoses, he talks about, a round world, right? The argument, Columbus thought, based on a particular skewed way of reckoning, he thought that the world was a smaller sphere than it was, right? So he thought, well, if we load up our ships that you're going to give us with enough food and water, we can easily get to China, easily get to Japan and China, because it's only that far, right? They were priests, but they're also scientists at Salamanca, say, it's about twice the size, actually, and you're going to run out of food and water, right? And actually, the way it turned out, like the luckiest man alive, the theologians were right about the size. Columbus, to his dying day, thinks that he's discovered China and Japan, which is why it's called the Indies. And had it not been for this kind of big continent in the middle, then he would have run out of water so. But then this, by the time, centuries later, and there's a particular, you can trace where this kind of story picks up. And it's one thing for the false account to come out. It's another thing for it to kind of speak to people and for people to think that this, in a pithy, easily tellable way, encapsulates a great truth about the relationship between science and religion, okay? In the same way that the Galileo affair, which actually, if you have to pick episodes where science and religion seem to be in conflict, to religion's detriment, then that's a good one. I mean, they didn't make that one up. But it's far more complicated than the story that gets told. And in fact, it's an argument largely between different scientists, which often happens. It's not just like Galileo is the scientist versus all the religious people. They were the scientists as well. So you get these kind of inter-scientific discussions, but then can be told in a particular way that at a particular moment in time seems to speak to people and to express something true and universally true. So these kind of narratives, it's a really good book. It's New York Times bestseller or whatever by a Nobel Prize-winning economist. I think Robert Schiller or Stiller or Spiller. called Narrative Economics, and he's precisely talking about this. It's like, why do certain kind of easy narratives take hold within populations and then have real effects? Okay? And we see in the part, and this science and religion story, we've got to move on, but it's a specifically anti-Catholic story. Okay, it's science versus religion, but what they mean by religion is like the Catholic Church. And actually it's a particular liberal Protestant, like science versus religion, that's bad, that kind of religion's bad, but hey, what about a new way of viewing science, a new way of viewing religion, our way? So there's a whole, there's a big American anti-Catholic social history that this all plays into at the time. And over time, then then evangelical Protestantism, fundamentalism gets packaged into this kind of bigger story. But at the beginning, it's mainly anti-Catholic. Now, it's perfectly possible to tell a completely opposite story by picking different moments, by picking different people, by emphasizing different things. You can tell a story as more historically plausible than the other one, that emphasizes Blessed Nicholas Steno, who was a convert, a bishop, and often called the father of modern geology, that emphasizes Nicholas Copernicus. Karen spoke about this yesterday. You talk about Copernicus rather than Galileo, and it shifts things a bit. Georges Mendel, the founder of modern genetics. Georges Lemaitre, the founder of modern cosmology. You can tell a story, and it's a selective story, that kind of puts the Catholic Church front and center at the vanguard of science throughout history, and as arguably the greatest kind of institutional champion of scientific research throughout, until very recently, throughout much of Western history. This is the reason why there's so many, craters on the moon are named after Jesuits. They didn't you fill in those things, name a star after your loved one. They didn't do that. It's just because there were so many Jesuit astronomers. It's why if you go to Arizona, there's the Vatican, the Pope has his own observatory there. It's that kind of thing. But so you can tell a very different story, but it's also a partial story. You can tell, and it's probably a truer story than the classic one, but still, there's so much complexity and so many times, and religion, as I say, religion means a lot, science means a lot, and it's very difficult to tell a single narrative that kind of all plays into each other. But obviously that's not the way that most people, most of the time, encounter science and religion. They absorb something from the wider culture, if you like, that science versus religion, that's a thing. And religious people, on average, tend to be less scientific, and atheists tend to be super rational and super evidence, and because they tell us this, but also, who do you see on the who are like the famous atheists? Well, it used to be people like Madeleine Murray O'Hair, which is when atheism wasn't very popular in the 60s, and now it's Richard Dawkins. It's scientists, philosophers, right? And the other thing that plays into this is a particular reason why a particular story takes hold. But alongside this, and I think adding a lot of intuitive appeal to that story, is a very skewed understanding of what the word faith means. And it's a skewed understanding that we have to take some of the blame for, because you hear it all the time from Christians. And there aren't many. There are. If you go through Miracle on 34th Street, the original, and you go through the God Delusion, there aren't many points when you think, this reminds me of the other one. But common to both, and this really emphasizes that this is an idea that's out there, is this definition of faith as something irrational. And if you've got evidence and reasons, you don't have faith, you don't need faith. You have certainty or belief or whatever, but faith is something that you only bring in as a last resort when you don't have any better reasons. Faith is believing something when common sense tells you not to. Although actually she was right, so you kind of think, well, If you watch the next 5 minutes of that film, you think, well, hang on a minute. Seems that she won that. Or is blind trust in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence? So faith is something that is, by definition, inimical to reason and evidence. And therefore, if Christians go around talking about faith, you've got to have faith. That's George Michael. But Christians, I'm sure Christians say it too, and this is what people understand, including those people who are saying it. Then obviously, religion must be this thing that is at best irrelevant to the facts, right? And you often get people say, well, I don't really care about science, faith is more important, right? Atheists believe in evidence, and religious people believe in faith, and if I had to pick, I'd rather go with faith, because it's nicer, right? I don't know. But this just is, I can't say this often enough, faith does not mean this, and it never meant this. It never meant this in the Christian tradition, it never meant this in the rich Christian tradition. Faith is from the Latin word fides. The word confidence. If you have confidence in someone, you are with trust. Faith is a word that just means trust. Fiduciary, something to do with money. But there's a trust people will know this. People with more money than me will know what this means, right? But there's a fiduciary responsibility, and I think that means that I'm giving my money to you, and there's like legal reasons why I can trust you with my money, right? Dogs. Trustworthy, faithful dogs are called Fido. At least they're in Britain. Clearly not here. Clearly that's not a thing here. But in Britain, the stereotype dog name is Fido. Maybe we're more classical. I don't know. Yeah, right, sure. Rover didn't quite work. But okay. So, faith. And actually, the way we normally use this word doesn't mean that or that. If a student comes to me and say, sorry, I've had so much on, my mum's died, and maybe not. Well, no, yeah, okay. I mean, there'll be a bit more pastoral stuff that goes into the answer I'm about to give, but, we'll ignore that. There's a good reason why, they need an extension or whatever. And that, I promise I'll do it or whatever. And I say, yeah, that's fine. I've got faith in you. I've got faith in you. Now, if that meant what that means, that would mean I've absolutely no reason to believe you when you say you're going to get me the essay. I have every reason in the teeth of evidence to think that you're lying to me, but I'm choosing to have this thing called faith, right? If I, loan someone $10 and they promise to give it back to you, and I'm like, yeah, don't worry about it, I have total faith in you. Well, that would be an insult if it actually meant what we sometimes say we think it means. But when we normally use the word faith, we just mean trust. And trust can be for good reasons or bad reasons, okay? Many of the things that I have the most faith in, I think I have excellent reasons for grounding that faith. Any amount of evidence of, my wife's love and, wonderfulness grounds my faith in her, right? Or my family or whatever else. Whereas if it didn't, if it was like, oh, no, I have complete faith in you. Anyway, so this gets to the heart that there's this kind of, outside of rooms like this, there's this kind of wild definition of faith that is just out there in the culture in all sorts of ways. And people hear the word faith, at least in certain contexts, and think, oh, it must be an irrational thing, it must be an anti-faith thing, an anti-evidence thing. And it's ridiculous. But this is the kind of, when we're thinking about evangelization, when we're thinking about kind of breaking down people's ingrained prejudices and stereotypes and all sorts of stuff, if people have this idea that religion, and particularly Christianity, particularly Catholicism, is something about faith, and they're also about faith. Well, if that's how people understand that word, then it's going to be an uphill battle. And this isn't a particularly... I think one of the other things is that what happens is that parts and loud parts of religion, prominent parts of kind of religion, really lean into this. Really lean into there being a conflict between science and religion. This is a cartoon that came out around the kind of the 1920 Scopes trial around teaching evolution in public schools. And, the idea is that, Darwinian evolution, the path of education, leads to disbelief in the God and the Bible. So the idea that this Pied Piper is through education, through science, through reason, that's what leads people towards atheism. So it's almost as if, again, by no means a representative sample of, theologians and religious leaders in the country, but this gets out there, this gets in the press, it gets in the popular culture. This idea that, the churches are saying that science and atheism go together. They've kind of given science, you have science, we don't need science. Welcome to it. And so there's a sense in which, we're fighting against these kind of vaguely received and ingrained and that have just become normal people who don't really sit down and think about things. They sit down and read the history of science, really, anything like that. It's just kind of floating out. And so we need, first of all, to be just aware of it. And obviously conferences like this help, because not only does it every time, you get a big religion thing that's like science or religion, people will think, science and religion, I didn't think they liked science, that's new. But also it equips the people who come to these things to have more confidence in talking about these kind of things. Okay. Now I want to change tack a bit and talk about it was all part of one big Templeton-funded project that went for 3 years, and there's now a follow-on called Understanding Unbelief, that I was one of the main leaders of. And we did a lot of different stuff, but one of the ideas was to try and map what it means to be an atheist or agnostic. We've got some idea of, there's been studies done, we've surveys done in America, parts of Europe. But what does this look like in China, Japan, Brazil, Denmark? So on the one hand, there's this kind of big, just the different types of atheism, the different types of agnosticism, the different types of ways in which actual atheists and agnostics think about things, worldviews, how this relates to morality, how this relates to how they find meaning in life, relates to all sorts of stuff. And then as a sub-project within that, I had a very fun period going around America, talking to who I call non-verts. So this is people who were raised in a religion to different degrees. So some of them will be like, we were in church 8 times a week. You laugh because you're Catholics, but if I get an evangelical, they'd be like, only 8. Well, there's your reason right there, right? I interviewed someone, she went 3 times on a Sunday. Everyone's like, that'd put me off. But obviously there's a huge spectrum, because there's, what it means to be religious, there's a huge, that can mean all sorts of stuff. What it means to have been raised religious could mean all sorts of stuff. For some people, that's just we were baptized, and when grandma came, we went to church, I think probably only she went to church when she came, but everyone was kind of built into this kind of delusion together. Or it can mean, a very serious kind of personal relationship with Christ, and a real ownership and practice and commitment, and then something happens. And obviously the people who had the stronger kind of religious commitment, if they leave, that's often the bigger, more dramatic, often very painful story. often family conflict, all sorts of stuff. And some of this might be familiar from some of your own families, friends, siblings. There's a big trend in America over the past 3 decades, which is nothing in kind of socio-cultural terms, of, the people who said they had no religion in America, was about single digits till, right into the early 90s, mid-90s, depending on quite how you ask the question. And then you'll be well familiar with this, but then it just goes up and up and up and up and up and up. And so part of the reason for that book was just to try and understand why and how that plays out in different denominations, because you often get kind of 2 different types of stories. You get stories that focus on individuals, and you get stories that focus on kind of big societal level trends. And both of those are important, but there's a middle level, which is how it plays out in, whether you're an evangelical or whether you're a Catholic or whether you're mainline or whether you're Mormon, this plays out very differently. And it also creates different types of non-verts. So, ex-Catholic nons are very different as a group to ex-evangelical nons, to ex-Mormon nons, to people who were raised with no religion. Okay? So that's what that book's trying to do. And what I want to do, there's some interesting stuff here about how those people think about science and think about religion that I just want to share with you. Because I think it complicates a lot of the what we think we know. So, and ignore the other countries. Yeah. Just pretend these don't exist. Well, keep an eye on that one. But I've particularly focused UK and the US, partly because, there's, word on fire is a big thing in Britain. And so, hopefully some people back in Britain might watch this and think, I can't believe he made that joke, Christ. So the dark about, and it's trying to do a lot on a single graph there. But the darker thing is people who are atheists or agnostics, and this isn't just people who identify. So there's 2 types of being an atheist. One is that when asked what is your religion, you write in atheist, right? Which there's a small proportion. But the other way is to ask people, and there's sort of a standard way of sociologists asking this, is like on a 7-point scale, which comes closest to your views about God or gods. And it goes from kind of, I don't believe there's a God, to, I definitely believe there's a God, to, sometimes not, to, I don't believe in a God and I don't believe there's any way to find out. And that's the classic agnostic. And then you get things like, I don't believe in a personal God, but I believe in a higher power of some kind, and kind of a benevolent something that a lot of people like. But anyway, so not wholly surprisingly, atheists and agnostics tend to kind of what you might think of as a kind of a classic scientific answer. I don't know if people at the back can see it, but the scientific method is the only reliable path to knowledge. 70% of atheists and agnostics in the USA agree or strongly agree to that, compared to only 33% of the general population. So yeah, atheists and agnostics tend to a scientistic worldview. Not wholly surprising, but there you go. It's sometimes good when surveys tell us what we think we know, because then it gives you confidence when they tell you something new. Because if they only ever told you stuff that seemed strange and unlikely, then you might doubt the survey. You say, well, it seems strange. But if it mostly confirms what you think you know, and then every so often it tells you something, then you think, well, what do we not know that we thought we know, and this might be interesting. And then the other one is humans have developed over time from simpler non-human life forms. So this is a very kind of a broadly evolutionary position that's trying to capture all the different nuances of that. Humans have developed over time from simpler non-human life forms. And in America, it's only about as many as or only about half the population who affirm this. Among atheists and agnostics, it's about 80% of them. And you think, well, yeah, that makes sense. But then you think, well, what about the other 20%? The atheists and agnostics who don't think human beings have developed over time from simpler non-human life forms. What? Some of those, this is where you think, that'd be something to dig into a bit, right? Now, some of those are just say, well, we don't know, I don't care. Some of them are going to say, like, aliens. It's aliens. And we're going to come back to that. Aliens. But again, what we think we know about the kind of the stereotype, these aren't just nons. We're going to talk about nons in general. And nons in general, there's a broad, range of religious and spiritual view. Like only about a third of them are atheists or agnostics, of the kind of people who take no religion, right? Some of them say that they pray every day, they're very religious, all that kind of stuff, but they have no religion. So the nons are a very broad category. Atheists and agnostics are kind of like the hard secular end of the nons. And even at that hard secular end of the nons, 1 in 5 of them have some interesting views about human origins, shall we say. There's not a lot you can do with this, but you give people a list of about 49 different things, from truth down to brisket or something, I don't know, and ask what are the 5 things that define your values? Bass Pro Shop, I don't know. And again, it's difficult, there's so much there, but the darker one is the atheists and agnostics. The lighter one is the general population, which includes those atheists and agnostics, but just everyone. And the purple is the USA and the green is the UK. Ignore Britain. We used to be a thing. And for the vast majority, it's just you look through the world and there's huge differences across the world in all sorts of stuff. Most people quite like their family, at least in the abstract, right? Quite like freedom, not in China. Compassion, learning, people tend to have the same sorts of values, okay? Science isn't a big one in America. Even among American atheists and agnostics, these people are not, when picking from a list, are not saying science is my core value. Some of them do, right? But, it's not ranking in the top 5 overall. It does in other countries, Brazil, China, it features. It's not at the top. But family, freedom, friendship, truth, compassion. Apart from God in the mix, fairly similar, which again is what you expect. We think about people as not, we kind of pigeonhole people into groups, right? But there's also a reason, everyone lives in the same kind of country. It may not feel like different bits of it, but, it's not a surprise that, at the general level, especially given the variety that makes up any of these groups, that there's all sorts of commonalities across them. This is interesting. I'll let you decide. I think this is interesting. So you ask. So there's this idea, and there's this idea in the popular culture as well as in kind of sociology, that atheists, especially the people who actually tick not just nons but atheists, must therefore also be what we call philosophical and materialists or naturalists, that they have a worldview which doesn't include supernatural entities, and they have a very evidence-based, sciencey, normie kind of view of the world that doesn't take into account odd things. And if you read the kind of the best-selling atheist books, they just assume that is what atheists are like. Okay. And if you read things like the very short Atheism, a very short introduction by Oxford, kind of like a standard, very good introduction to atheism and what atheists believe, he says, well, yeah, we're calling it atheism, but what we really mean is philosophical naturalism. Okay. Because all atheists are basically, they don't believe in anything supernatural, because that's stupid. It doesn't quite say that, but it's implied. But again, if you ask them, right? So the general population is the right-hand column, the gray one, okay? Orange is agnostics, blue is atheists. So this is people who say they don't believe in God, but believe to some degree of strength life after death. Atheists, agnostics, again, I'm not going to break down each one, but, over 1 in 10. Reincarnation, 15% about both groups. Now, that's not a terrible surprise. There's Buddhist, certainly forms of Buddhism. Classical Buddhism has lots of gods, it's full of them. But there are forms of Buddhism where there's no particular kind of gods, but there's this kind of supernatural mechanism, of reincarnation and rebirth. So it may be that that's what those people are tapping into, to some degree. Astrology, kind of, if you have to pick a kind of stereotype, irrational thing, right? Astrology. Objects with mystical powers. So this is like crystals that, whatever crystals do. Never, or like mountains that have some kind of particular woo-ness about, I don't know. People with mystical powers, so this is clairvoyance, or people who telekinesis, or people who have all sorts of stuff. Significant events, this is kind of a softer one, but significant events are meant to be. So this is people, and I often see this on Facebook among like otherwise completely secular people that talk about, half seriously, like thanking the universe for finding their partner, the universe. People always put out gratitude to the universe, or so there's this kind of sense that we live in they don't want to say God, because God is the thing that religious people, and they don't like religion. There used to be one. They're grown up. They're not going to talk about God, but they're going to still affirm a kind of a conscious agent, a benevolent conscious agent behind it all. But that's not God, no. It's a higher power. It's something. Right? Supernatural being. So this, there's a more specific. The actual question is longer, but it's angels, demons, ghosts, jinn. Champy. I don't know if anyone's from Vermont, but no, it's not really. Need to kind of work on my local references. Underlying force of good and evil, universal spiritual life force, which is that kind of like higher power, or karma. So there's a significant proportion of atheist agnostics who are some kind of spooky atheist, call them like spooky atheists, right? Okay, that they are very happy holding positions that on the one hand, some of these, there's all sorts of, these are a hugely broad set of things. Some of them, I'm not saying there's not scientific, but generally speaking, mainstream kind of views would think that, first of all, normal people don't believe these things. And actually, if you ask people, then a lot of normal people believe a lot of stuff, right? But also that there's significant proportions of atheists and agnostics who aren't obviously scientific, aren't obviously like super, I'm all about reason and science and evidence, aren't obviously philosophical materialists. And it's good for us to know that, because there's this whole thing that if we're trying to reach the nons or trying to reach atheists and agnostics, best lead with the evidence and the science. Yeah? Well, it's actually, let's lead with some of the weird Catholic stuff. We've got better, like, miracles and supernatural agents and underlying force of good and evil, and you think reincarnation's cool. find out about resurrection. No, so there's that, we've kind of, and this is something about what Bishop Barron was talking about, dumbing down. It's more that kind of soft playing the miraculous, soft playing the weird, actually. We've got a lot of that in the Catholic tradition that we lost, and we lost a lot with it. There was an understandable thing after the council of thinking, well, we need to get rid of all the superstition and all the outdated stuff and all that kind of stuff. And actually, yes, like some of the popular devotions were bought. I've got friends from Brazil who, like, if you hadn't got a husband, then you'd take some. I'm kind of probably insulting people's cultures. I probably shouldn't do this, but you take Anthony out, Anthony of Padua, and you'd bury him upside down in the garden until he found you a man. So you'd punish him until he went and found you a man, right? Now, I'm not saying that doesn't work, right? I'm saying we got rid of stuff like that. We tried to, because actually that stuff we didn't get rid of. We got rid of, like, the rosary, right? We got rid of, lighting candles. We got rid of the statues, let alone the lighting the candles. We got rid of all sorts of the devotional, partly because of the idea, and this is leading into a whole other book. I'm just going to try and shill one book, I think, just for today. I'll leave the other stuff. And this is the UK. So the UK, it's we're kind of it's interesting, but not interesting enough for me to talk about. I don't know if you ever see, I think I've got time for a tangent. Everyone's like, oh, God, really? We've had nothing but. Right, suppose, and this is there's an important point buried in this. I want you to think, well, he said there was, and I trust him. Faith. If I pitched to a mainstream American documentary channel, okay? And yeah, I watch a lot of Discovery Channel and History Channel, and most of the shows are about either Hitler, sharks, or Bigfoot. Some of them are about two things at once. And my dream is to get all three, right? But if I pitch to a major network, I've got this idea for a show, and what it's going to do, every week, we're going to just kind of like pick out, we're just not going to focus on a single religion, we're going to get all the religions, right? We're going to pick out bits of the scriptures or bits of kind of, popular devotion or like episodes in the history where the traditional understanding has been like God or miracles. And we're going to go along and we're going to say, oh no, if you look at this historically and psychologically, then what's probably going on here is that there's a kind of Chinese whispers effect and the stories aren't written down until centuries later, and things get exaggerated, and probably if you were there at the time, there'd be nothing very interesting. And they'd say, we can't do that, there'd be complaints. You can't just go through people's religions and do that, right? Well, all right then. All right, okay. New idea. Same show. Same for every religion. We're going to go through it, pick out all the kind of interesting bits, the bits people really love and the stories, and say it's aliens. And they say, yeah, that sounds great. And that show then becomes probably the most popular documentary show on the History Channel now. Okay, it's called Ancient Aliens, and it's been going about 20 seasons, and that's literally what they do. I mean, it's the most thoroughgoingly atheistic show that you can imagine, and millions of people watch it. Right? Every episode. And I'm not even making these examples up, right? This is a typical episode you'll watch and be like, oh, the Ark of the Covenant. In the book of, traditionally, religious people have imagined it's God doing this. But, of course, there are no gods, a far more rational hypothesis is to imagine that the Ark of the Covenant is a small portable nuclear generator attached to an algae, like if you have a fish tank, the scum, an edible algae machine that the pipes need to be cleaned out every week, and that's what the Sabbath is. So it has to make a double amount of edible algae, the manna, the day before, so they can do a proper clean out of the pipes once a week. And that's the explanation. And there's a market for this. And I often think, I've been doing a lot of watching of this show for a long time. Research. It's research. And it strikes me that there's a sense in which this is atheism for fundamentalists. Okay, so this is people who take their scriptures seriously but think that God is irrational. Right? And they don't just do it with the Bible, they do it with the Quran, they do it with the Vedas, they do it with, everything. Norse mythology, all sort of Greek mythology, it's all, you watch it, there's a whole philosophical, theological worldview that's being presented in this show. And if you ever every so often, and Eric von Däniken, some of you will be aware of, does precisely this with million-selling books over many decades. Now, when we think of popular atheism, that isn't what we think of. But I'm pretty sure that that's a much bigger carrier of an atheistic worldview. Not a secular, scientific, evidence-based, well, actually not necessarily philosophical, because they say, well, no, this isn't supernatural, because this is technology, it's a technological explanation. These are aliens who are doing this with, who have probably evolved themselves, and they have, we're not invoking the supernatural to explain this. But this is very far from the stereotype, atheists are super rational, all about the evidence, all about kind of contemporary science and the best history and that kind of stuff. So, again, and I think we often have this in, well, science. The problem is that, religious people don't understand that, there's all this kind of rich scientific tradition in their own churches, especially the Catholic Church. And they don't understand, like teens don't, our kids don't understand that there's this harmony between science and religion, like what Father Spitz was talking about, Karen, yesterday, Professor Erdberg. But we also have this other view, which is like, the atheists, we need to break down this kind of hard rationality. And some of them, it's not that there isn't this kind of super, show me the evidence, scientific, rational world. But also, it doesn't do anyone any favors for us to stereotype that group and for us to understand that there's all sorts of different denominations, if you like, within contemporary atheism. And I just want to finish, because this is surveys tell you a lot, and they tell you a lot in the big picture, but they kind of give you a skeleton to hang stuff on. But in order to kind of really understand things, you just need to talk to real people. Okay, so for the non-verts, for the book, there's a lot of kind of statisticky stuff in there, not to put anyone off, but a lot of it was just me going around and sitting in bars and talking to people, which is a good way to living, right? And I just want to give two very brief snapshots of different people I interviewed coming from different worlds. So Daniel, as I call him, male 30s, lives in the Pacific Northwest, raised in a very weakly cultural Catholic way. Second generation Polish Catholic. I think the mum sent them to Mass, but didn't go herself. And when they were like, hey, hang on a minute, why do we have to go? And she was like, I just wanted a break, frankly. So there was no, but again, still saw themselves as Catholics, still went to Catholic school, still being Polish, of course we're Catholic, we're Polish. There's this whole kind of second, third generation immigrant thing, okay? And he's really interested in the Catholic. Thinks much of it is evil and wrong, but he really likes the Jesuits. No. He's really like a fanboy of the Jesuits. He didn't go to Jesuit schools or anything like that. And his girlfriend, who's ex-Jehovah's Witness, teases him about this because she's not a fangirl of anything about the Jehovah's Witness, but he has this soft spot for certain bits of the Catholic tradition, which is a very kind of cultural Catholic, it's like we don't believe any of it, we never went to Mass. Frankly, we're horrified by this or that, but hey, it's St. Patrick's Day, we're Catholic, there's bits we can kind of tap into. But it struck me that despite all this, despite not being a very long way from the church and from belief and from anything, the one thing he did like about the Catholic Church was how sciencey it is, especially compared to other traditions. And he particularly cited, he's a psychologist and he does a lot of sort of therapy work with people who've left kind of new religious movements, okay? So this is not someone who's a massive fan of the Catholic Church. I look at the Catholic Church and be like, yeah, they're not doing such a bad job. I mean, they're doing loads of terrible stuff. But they have a chief astronomer. And the Pope talks about climate change. So they're fairly accepting of science, which some religions aren't. Okay? And then it's a married couple. This was like their night out from the kids. And, reminiscing about their kind of upbringing in Southern Baptist circles in Texas and talking about the power team and all sorts of weird evangelical subculture, Americana, which, I loved. But again, I wasn't asking questions about, hey, what do you think about the Pope? Or what do you think about the Catholic Church? I wasn't asking about science. I was just letting them talk. They, ex-evangelicals, there's all sorts of traumas, and they've got not a good word to say about what they were raised in and were at one time very deeply committed to. But they look to the Catholic Church and think, hey, Pope's always talking about evolution. That's new. Again, there's this whole media narrative that is problematic because popes have always been. No one's like, hey, I love that Pius XII. He's always talking about science. And he was on the cover of Rolling Stone. And you didn't get that with Pius XII, right? And you didn't get it with any of the other ones. You get it with Francis. And that's a good thing, but it's also a difficult thing given that it is that the church gets viewed through a very particular lens, right? And that skews like a hall of mirrors. But let's focus on the positives here. These are people who are coming battered and bruised out of church. And they look to the Catholic Church and think, oh, looks pretty good. So it's very easy at a conference like this, and right, that we think that the whole world out there looks to not just religion in general, but the Catholic Church as having a science problem. And that's undoubtedly true. But it's also worth being aware of, depending on where people have come from, depending on what people have as their kind of benchmark religion, then a lot of the work that the people who've come all this way to kind of think about and be committed to, about putting out the church's relationship with science, telling a different story, telling a counter-narrative. A lot of that work is out there already. There's a lot of people who are nons, atheists, deeply, with good reason, skeptical of big church, organized religion, right? Who look to the Catholic Church and say, well, look, if they're doing one thing right, and that's certainly compared to what we were told as kids, they seem pro-science. And actually, that's something that we can work with. There's more to be done. But actually, that's just to flag up that a lot of the, door opening, there's a crack there often. And, whatever the church has done, just what it's done, but also what it's done to help get this out there. Hasn't completely fallen on deaf ears. And this was striking time and again. All over the country, talking to nons, people would specifically cite the Catholic Church as on the better side of things, at least when it comes to science. So, there's no kind of easy, pithy way of summing up what I've been trying to do for the past hour. I'm sure you've got pithy summations of what I've been doing in the past hour, but I'll let you take them to the confessional. But just to say that there's a real complexity and diversity, both among Christians and among the Christian tradition about science and religion, but also among atheists and nons, not only when it comes to their own kind of scientism or not, but also in how they perceive specifically the Catholic Church in relationship with science. And what I don't often get a big room, but what I like to do is, try and, especially when you've been kind of going all over the place, and try and weave it all together at the end and, into a joke, okay? Everyone's like, and I've thought a lot about this, and so I couldn't think of one. So thank you very much.